Joe Ribeiro is on.
Okay.
Mark Kraft's here.
Okay.
Carl Stevens.
Okay, Carl. Who else do we have?
Hi, this is
Joe.
Timmy with AT&T, Timmy Aguilar.
Okay.
Joe Branson's here.
All right.
Tony No Graves is here.
All right. Any other governing board members?
Lyle Moore's here, APHU.
Okay, Lyle.
You can see us that are just logged in and not on the phone, right?
Yeah, Chad, we can see you for sure.
So that
The
gives us-
chief,
is that 7 board members?
I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, 7. So we don't have a quorum.
No.
So do you have me down? Eric, Bob, Piper?
Yeah, I have you down, Bob, Joe, Mark, Carl, Lyle, Chad, myself. So we won't have a quorum until Brian gets on. He's going to be a few minutes late.
Paul is on as well.
So, Paul is on. That gives us 8. So that should give us a quorum, right?
Yep.
All right. So let's get the always impossible to get done meeting minutes approved. Everybody should have a copy of the October meeting minutes. If nobody has any changes, would somebody like to make a motion to approve those meeting minutes?
Just Bob, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
All right.
Second.
Second that. All right. Moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right.
All opposed? Same sign. All right. So the October 2017 meeting minutes have been approved. Our first item on the agenda is economic analysis presentation by Signals as far as the revenue of opt-out. You guys want to go ahead and do
Chief.
that? Yeah.
Sarah Smith here. Just who seconded for the notes?
Oh, yeah. Who seconded it? I heard somebody say it.
That was me, Lyle.
Thanks,
All right.
Lyle.
All right. Now we'll move into the economic opt-out analysis from Signals.
Okay,
Randy?
great. Okay, good. So
Randy, are you ready? Randy,
Oh.
are you ready for me to stop share?
oh yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay, here it comes.
Before we go into the economic analysis, can anyone else who joined the call please state your name?
This is Erin McLaughlin with the AG's office.
Sarah Tracy from First Mint on.
Hey, Sarah, this is Chris Olson with AT&T.
Bob Piper with the City of Arvada, CML.
Ken Malm, AT&T.
Scott Newman, City of Aurora.
And
Thanks
Randy,
so much, everyone.
All right, Randy, you're back on.
Okay, great, good. So basically, I told Brian that we were allocating 20 minutes for this, and each of you kind of received a PDF version of a longer analysis from Brian this morning. So my thought was to basically step through a small number of highlight slides and just frame the issue, and you've got additional detail in front of you. And basically try to get through that in about 10 minutes, and then have 10 minutes for discussion, if that makes sense. So,
And Randy, this is Ed Mills. I have the official time, so I'll let you know at 10 minutes so that you can plan appropriately.
Good. Okay, good. So just the topics that we wanted to hit were, one, that just the history of financial studies, associated with First Debt as an endeavor over many years, and then the types of sites and kind of costs per site, the overall budget of what a build out would cost, both capital and expense, and then talk a little bit about the spectrum management lease agreement, which has been a topic of public discourse, in the last period of months, and just try to frame that in terms of where that fits in our discussions. So just as a little bit of background, one of the first things that appeared in public was basically an ex parte discussion between Siren Call and the FCC in 2007, and part of that was a proposal and a study saying you could build a network for first responders with these engineering assumptions and this number of sites. And it was followed by a couple of different academic studies, and then a study by the FCC, and then a study by the Congressional Budget Office. And in the long pack that we sent out, it includes a number of the financials, which took different forms. But on this slide here, what we're one of the KPIs that came out from all of them was basically an assertion that it would take a certain number of sites. And what was interesting is there was a common assumption between all of them that you would build a first responder network up to a 99% population coverage threshold. And so one of the things that we did when we embarked upon just thinking about the economics was we fired up the Signals Analytics economic model, which is a proprietary tool we built about a decade ago, which you can take any geography pretty much around the world and say, I want to build a network in this band with this technology and with these kind of coverage attributes in terms of population and area and other things. And we did a simulation for the US over, with different degrees of coverage. And what's interesting is popping out of that, when we set it to 99% of POPs, it comes up with a number that's very close to the average of the other studies. So that was, sort of interesting and confirming. So that's the good news. The bad news is, what do you get for 99% of POPs? And the answer is you don't get all that much. So if you're in Maryland or Virginia or a lot of East Coast cities, things look good. In the Western US, they don't look nearly as good. There's a lot of empty space. So in this picture here, this is has two layers to it. The bottom picture, basically you've got either this grayish blue colored cell or a dark purple, and the dark purple are covered, so that's within the 99%, and the lighter cells are in the outside, in the 1% that's not covered. And we overlaid on top of this FirstNet's coverage objectives, and you can see that to a very large extent it sort of aligns philosophically with the 99% objective. So what's interesting is if you then go back and scale things to Colorado, for about 630 sites is about what you get, out of the national total, if that's your objective. But we know, from our series of 8 hypothetical studies, we ended up ideally having about 1,459 sites. But if you throw out national forest and places that are harder to get, is 1377. So the difference here is in coverage objective. It's very simple. So in this next little section, what I'd like to do is talk about, basically what it costs to get to a network that would have, the larger coverage footprint, and then break that down into categories of sites, and then eventually sort of frame it in terms of decisions. So first of all, as I think most people know, when we've looked at, the wide range of hypothetical designs, we had probably 20 categories of sites, and we had every major commercial provider. One of the very fruitful sources was community anchor institutions. And so this is sort of a simplified view. And this says if you're building a network for Colorado, what you would like to have is, or what you might expect is, say, 1,000 sites, and these are sites that are not just in the ground, but actually appropriate to a 700 megahertz build. that would be associated with an existing operator, and then you would continue to build outside of that. And in this case, we've sort of broken it down into 3 categories of community anchor institution sites. So you already have a location, presumably with a building, with electricity, with certain resources that lowers your cost. And then there's a small number of sites, and here it's 57 that are just way out in the middle of nowhere. And those you would put in the ground, but at a higher price point. So this is sort of what it looks like as a hypothetical build plan. So for your 800, you do nothing. You know, your existing operator has LTE, and you basically use that. And this is very much analogous to the relationship between FirstNet and AT&T, where it doesn't have to be band 14. In fact, there is no band 14 on day one, but you use the existing network. Here, we take 200 sites and we basically overlay them with a band 14 sort of veneer. And sort of the argument here is it just gives you a consistent population coverage in band 14. You don't really need that, but from a compliance standpoint, someone might ask for it, so we've put it in there. There are several categories here of community anchor institutions and then remote sites, and you'll see the price point changes. If we're just doing an overlay with a fully equipped commercial site, it's very inexpensive, and this is kind of an FCC estimate of just over $100K. And then as we go into things that are more complex, the price goes up. We're also leveraging, very importantly, the fiber builds that exist within the state. And you can see here there are different tower heights here. And basically our reference designs run from 30 to 50 meter towers. And as we look at the economics, we've got a bunch of reference points. We have, the FCC has done a comprehensive study. We did a bottoms-up design where we looked at every piece part and said, what does it cost? And got some reference points there. American Tower has put together a nice piece where they've basically disclosed a lot of, the costs across North America for just the site itself. And then and you can see their numbers actually align with many others. And then in the places where we have existing assets, it's less. So I'm not going to go through each of these, but just to give you an example, for instance, here with our more expensive site, this is about close to $500,000. But here we have a 50-meter monopole, which is, it's sort of in the ground for $100,000, and it's a 165-foot site. So this is actually a great price. And basically, in dialogue with people who've done a lot of construction within the state of Colorado, site construction, we've kind of asked, what could you do to knock down the cost of key components? And one idea here is actually to do a large volume procurement of tower structures where you've got maybe just 1 or 2 reference designs, where there's a big procurement all at once, but very little variation. So we did that. We have kind of LTE and tower electronics. We have a generator, with a cement pad and a 1,000-gallon tank of diesel and the fuel and all of that. We have site acquisition costs. We have, do some trenching to bring in electricity, and we've got a fully loaded microwave, which we've actually sort of configured to 6 nines availability on the premise that your backhaul is life and death critical. And that could probably be cut back a little bit. That's just a quick snapshot, and then we've got similar permutations for other pieces, and these are described in detail in the package.
Randy, you're at 10 minutes.
Okay, very good. Okay, so what does that give you for the aggregate? So basically, if our grant is between 70 million and 88 million, these are the number of sites that we could have. And if we built out the whole thing, we're looking at about 145 million upfront build. And so relative to the grant, that leaves us with a 57 million shortfall. And we could deal with that in a number of ways. To our RFP offers, we've suggested that they identify revenue streams. We could do an excise tax and collect it, on mobile phone users. We could, cut some of the costs from sites largely by cutting out reliability, which, you may not want to do, or we could limit deployment, or we could use some combination. And so that's sort of a discussion for another day. You have not only CapEx, but you also have OpEx. And what's interesting here is, OpEx, a lot of it is your actual depreciation. And some things you need to do. So for instance, you'll need to redo your system software licenses periodically, and that's probably not avoidable. But some things you do have discretion on in terms of timing. And on a 10-year basis, with 10 years of expenses and your capital, we're coming in at about $500 million. And just to put this in perspective, this is $500 million for 1,377 sites. And some of you heard the consultant Rizzuto, who was commissioned by AT&T or by FirstNet, and basically his conclusion was 1,200 sites at $1 billion. So sort of the belief here is that it could be done for less. And part of the reason that we're able to do it for less, and we're actually spending more per site, is that we're heavily leveraging a commercial network. And this is very consistent with the philosophy of the NTIA and also of FirstNet and their relationship with AT&T. So just to frame up, I'm a couple minutes over here, but just to sort of frame up the decision, in the last few months, a lot of stuff has been released to states, and there have been a lot of congressional oversight meetings and other events where a lot of information has, become public. And so part of this is just talking about the Spectrum Lease Management Agreement, and sort of three elements have gotten a lot of discussion. One is spectrum lease payments. The other is termination fees. So if someone opts out and doesn't continue, what happens? And then the third is disincentive payments. And the first two are, and so the numbers that have been disclosed are top secret, but what's interesting is there are a lot of states and a lot of people have been subpoenaed to show up before political bodies and give answers. And so a lot of information has actually gotten into the press. So if we look at that, and here are some of the public sources, you can, for instance, with California, Vermont, New Hampshire, we know their termination fees. We have some data points for the leases as well. So if you take these and sort of calculate what, based on public information, you would think Colorado might be asked to pay, you would come up with numbers something like this. And to have even an approximate sort of order of magnitude view is very helpful in terms of the decision. So all of our careful financial analysis results in these bar graphs, and the things that are sort of less financial and more policy or politically driven are these, but they're all part of the decision. Just 2 points of perspective on this. So the early termination, if every state opted out and then failed and needed to pay the early termination, we're talking $119 billion, which is a stunning number. You could start with just bare earth and build a network for a very modest fraction of that. So that's a very big number. Also, in terms of spectrum lease, there's sort of an interesting dynamic where most spectrum today, an operator pays big bucks in an auction. AT&T didn't need to do that to get Band 14. It was allocated by Congress, to benefit first responders, and then flowed through to FirstNet and then to AT&T. And now suddenly the states who want to use it for first responders are being asked to pay, arguably full price. And so those are sort of conceptual things that people, I think, are grappling with. In terms of just, framing up decisions, obviously we have an opt-in, opt-out decision in the very near term, and it's something that we need to make. And the opt-in, the benefit is that there's no upfront cost to the state, which is great. There are costs incurred by individual agencies as they purchase service. In opt-out, there are a couple challenges. One is a very uncertain process. It's kind of like driving through a minefield. We don't know, if we're going to get to the other end. We also know that there are big, in addition to construction costs, there are other huge exogenous costs, and somehow that all needs to fit together. Sort of apart from that, that decision, which is a critical one, agencies need to make their individual decisions, and basically they'll have two public safety grade networks to choose from. One would be AT&T, or sort of the opt-out solution. The other will be Verizon, who's announced a public safety core. And then finally, there's a fourth alternative, which a year ago, no one would have even thought about, but sort of given the spectacular costs associated with opt-out, is something that we may want to consider. And this would be doing a completely different procurement effort, where you would say, thanks, but no thanks to the federal initiatives, and basically just say, start something that, where Colorado would say, we do want to build out, and we're going to somehow fund it, and it may be through a public-private partnership, but no thanks to, Band 14 and everything there. And you could argue, given what we know about the exogenous costs with the opt-out, that actually may be cheaper than an opt-out solution. So anyway, that's a ton of different things to think about, and I know I've overshot here a little bit, but let me stop and pause and take questions, and you guys have a written piece as well that you can look at for some reference.
All right, thanks, Randy. Anybody have questions for Randy?
This is Joe. I'm just sorry, wasn't quick enough off the mute button there, Eric. Sorry.
All right.
Just to maybe trying to get too much to the red, yellow, green here, but one thing I heard is a $57 million shortfall between grants and what Colorado would have to come up with. So simple math on that, I guess, if we're going to build out those sites, that's 100 sites. Great.
Yeah, and the
with
way
that kind of investment.
Yeah, the way we sort of framed it is we ran the numbers where we said we'll build the cheap sites first. So that takes us from 445 to 577, and 200 of those are just an overlay of Band 14 on existing sites. So really that's if we got the largest available possible grant, we'd have 245 new sites out of 377 that we desire.
So yeah, what's running through my head is if we're considering an investment into a network, one of the measures to look at is $57 million into an opt-out solution, or if we already had that money in our pocket, what would happen if we invested that in the opt-in network? And then another one that's pretty difficult probably to try to measure here is the idea of switching costs for the individual agencies. That's probably going to occur to a number of us regardless of which network we end up on. But I think that the impact and the desire to switch to an opt-out network might be a little more difficult when switching costs a little bit more to switching those costs a little bit more to an unknown or lesser known vendor or system than to a current kind of nationally or internationally known. Thank you.
Sure. Just one footnote here too is out of the 145 million, basically 20 million is going to sort of an overlay of the existing network, and everything else is basically new build. So let's just imagine that FirstNet were the partner network, So and we're just using a hypothetical operator. So this is a lot of investment beyond what any operator currently has in the ground. So if we were happy with sort of the coverage of existing operators, there wouldn't be a need to spend the vast majority of these dollars.
I think you've just touched and kind of expanded on what I was saying with that 57 million. If we're going to invest that in a network, discounting where we're going to get it, but if we're going to invest that kind of money in the network, one of our evaluations should be, is that better invested in an opt-in solution or an opt-out solution?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great analysis that we probably should do. And a year ago, we wouldn't have known to do it, but I think it is something that would be, a very appropriate thing to think about at this point in time.
Yeah, but I look at it a little bit differently than this, Bob. What did I hear the other day? Only 19% of our first responders use AT&T's current network.
That's right. 14%.
That's right, Bob.
Use.
Okay. So 14%. So that tells me we're pretty close to zero. So they don't really have the coverage today. And with a lesser network or an unknown network, it's still close to zero. So to me, there's going to be an investment of some sort to get above zero, to build the confidence. If we went in and opt in, I start looking at, the acceptance rates today are horrible on the opt in. So, this is where my mind's sitting is, if our first responder use them to, only uses 14% of them use it today, that tells me that the coverage is not that good. So that leads me to be very open to hearing both sides, because I feel like we're starting fresh on both. Just my opinion. Money is fine. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, before we get too far down that topic, Bob and Joe, that's part of what we'll be discussing in our next meeting, which is just the governing body, is some of those decision points as it relates to opt-in, opt-out. So let's not get too far down that road.
No problem.
All right. Any other questions for Randy on his analysis? All right. Has Brian joined us yet?
Yep, I'm on.
Go ahead.
I do have one quick analysis. Eric?
Okay. You did have one more question for Randy or not?
Well, the economics talked about build out again and all that cost. Are we going to discuss again the ongoing or sustainability cost of upgrades and maintenance and all that associated with keeping this project going for the next 25 years?
Yeah, so that was part of the operating expenses. You'll notice there's a big chunk of depreciation charge. So basically, you replace the entire network about 1.5 times, even in the 10-year window. So there's a substantial allocation of that, and of course, there's a lot of discretion in how quickly you move on that. But that was reflected in the numbers.
Okay, I lost the slideshow for a bit, so I may have just missed that part.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Hey, Randy, this is Chad. I just have a question of clarification. The numbers that you presented, the exorbitant opt-out costs, the penalties, for example, those sort of things, confirm those are actually not known, right? I mean, those are assumptions based on some leaks. Is that accurate? Or how I'm asking is, how confident are you that that's what those numbers actually look like? Because that looked amazing.
Oh, it is amazing, and I think directionally, so they are known to a very small group, and that we're ordered under to not disclose it. So those are derived from public numbers, and actually, if I think the order of magnitude, even by looking at other public sources, there's not that much variation. But so I think it's appropriate for an order of magnitude discussion. I would sort of frame it that way. And again, Brian can tell you, in a private setting exactly what all of this is. But it's a you know, the kind of, it's critically important to be able to have an open discussion of the magnitude. And, you know, sort of the thinking is that there's enough that's publicly known that we can do that, and just knowing that there's a little bit of noise there.
Do we have an idea as to why that is such a secret? I mean, that seems ridiculous that we need to be able to make a decision without knowing for sure what the possible consequences of an opt-out decision that doesn't work out, for example, are. I mean, that seems like a very overt attempt to disincentivize even the thought of opt-out.
Yeah, let's see. So is Brian on? Does he want to say a word?
Yeah, I'm here. So Sheriff, yes, I can confirm Randy's projections are in line with what we have seen. As he said, I can talk with you about what our specific state number would be. It is as exorbitant as Randy's nationwide projection has it. Supposedly, it's up for negotiation. We don't know really what that means at this point. But yes, so basically, Randy's analysis is on.
Does that answer your question, Chad?
Yeah, I'm rolling my eyes now.
I figured you were. All right. Any other questions for Randy, or are we ready to move on to Brian, and so you can talk about the opt-out RFP discussion? All right, Brian, why don't you go ahead and talk about the RFP decision?
Okay, great. So what we wanted to do with this next session and kind of these next two sessions is to update everyone on where the RFP process stands, provide an opportunity for some of the folks that were on the RFP committee to speak to the board and, you know, just discuss anything they would like to, and then kind of just have an open general discussion about, you know, opt-in versus opt-out from whomever's on the call, just a chance for stakeholders that are on the phone to address the board. So first off, we did complete the RFP process as of yesterday afternoon, very late yesterday afternoon. So the outcome of the process was that the review committee, and again, the review committee was a 7-member committee, a few of us from the board, and then a few other stakeholders, came to the conclusion of offering a bid from it was a partnership bid from Rivada and Macquarie. The conditional award basically states the award is contingent upon the FirstNet Colorado governing body making the appropriate recommendations to the governor, and then obviously the governor ultimately making the opt-out decision. So we've not had a lot of time to kind of review it and go over it. Literally, we got the letter out yesterday at I think like 4:55 or something like that. So just to kind of review how the process went and how we got to where we did. So we did have the initial round of RFP responses. We had 3 bids from the initial round. There was one non-compliant bid. So it wasn't that they were not qualified, they were just not compliant with the process. So the initial 3 bids that we received came from Rivada, Macquarie, and Verizon. Because so Macquarie and Rivada were the only 2 compliant bids. We reviewed those and pre-qualified both of those entities. We then asked for additional details from both Rivada and Macquarie, and the review committee went through those additional details, things such as detailed propagation maps, you know, engineering parameters, financial projections, you know, estimates to build, you know, operate, maintain, all those types of things. So the committee reviewed those, and based on those 2, they were not satisfied with either of the proposals at the time. So we then, it's called failing the RFP. So we failed the RFP, which then allows for the state to go into what's called competitive negotiations. So this is essentially a way for the review committee to speak directly with the individual entities bidding through a more a dialogue-based process. So we began that process back in October. And now with that process, all the entities that bid can come back into the discussion. So at that time, we were able to begin discussions with Verizon as well. And then also there was a 4th company called Foresight Group that submitted a bid as part of the 2nd round. And again, they were not compliant because they needed to submit one in the 1st round. But once we failed it and entered into the competitive negotiations, we were allowed to speak with them as well. So essentially over the last month, we've been holding one-on-one conversations with all 4 participants from the process. Recently, a few weeks ago, as part of this process, Rivada and Macquarie contacted our procurement lead, Judy Giovanni, and asked if they could kind of submit a revised joint proposal that would include both of them. That is allowed under the procurement code. And so we had some additional questions. So the review committee basically asked additional questions based on their proposed partnership that focused on kind of the dual nature of that. They submitted those questions, and then the committee met several more times. The committee did meet on Tuesday to review everything and come to the conclusion. I will say it was not a unanimous decision to award the Rivada Macquarie bid. There were multiple positions on what should happen out of the process. So some of the folks on the committee can talk through some of that. So the bid has been awarded. We technically are in our 7-day protest period. So the parties that were not awarded have, I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe it's 7 days to protest the award. We don't anticipate that, but you never know. So technically we're still in that process, but we can begin, having conversations with the joint bid of Macquarie and Rivada for that. So that's kind of a logistical summary of how we got here. Before I move on to kind of the content and next steps, any questions on the logistics and the process that we went through? Okay, so kind of where we are at now is obviously that information will be passed on to the governing body. The approach for both Rivada and Macquarie is somewhat analogous to your kind of design build approach, where in both proposals, while they proposed a draft proposal with actual specific sites and technical diagrams and propagation maps, obviously it is only a kind of a proposed technical solution. So if we were to choose them and choose to go down the opt-out path, essentially what we would be looking at is for the next 8 months, and remember that we have 8 months to present to the FCC, we would essentially be working that out, where we would work with the 2 companies and start to begin to finalize the design. We would identify specific sites. The Rivada proposal does include partnering with a commercial carrier. So we would, flesh out what that relationship looks like and how that works. We would, as I mentioned, firm up the design from both a backhaul perspective, a technical propagation perspective. We'd agree on the vendors. Obviously, that there's several vendors and partners involved in both bids, subcontractors, so to speak. So we would work through the agreements on that. We would then basically identify the ultimate cost to build and design and work out the ongoing business model, what that looks like in terms of user fees and formal construction costs, and then ultimately finalize that with our final plan. So in that scenario, the state would not be on the hook for anything until we actually went to the FCC and said, okay, we're going to be doing this. So that's kind of what the next 6 months would look like. Both companies had, while they have a similar approach to the process, there was different approaches to how the payments and how the business model operates in terms of a revenue perspective. So those details would need to be worked out a little bit. Rivada's bid focused more on monetization of the spectrum, whereas Macquarie's bid focused more on additional uses of the infrastructure to help offset the and user fees to manage that network. So I believe the combined bid, that would be part of the process, would be moving forward with the combined bid. So that's kind of the model. And with that, I would throw it out to anyone on the RFP committee, and by the way, the RFP committee was myself, Bob Pfeiffer, Don Nacarado, Chad Day, Jim Finlinson, and Scott Newman. That should be 7, I believe. And Gary Pasniak. So that's the 7 folks. So with that, I would open it up the floor to any of the folks that were on that review committee to address the board and just speak as to your thoughts on the process and anything you would like the board to know.
Brian, this
Anyone?
is Bob. Yeah, Brian.
Yes, Bob.
Process was great. A lot of hours for the rest of the board to know. I mean, for us that were there, especially for some of us that travel and try to juggle the meetings at the same time. a lot of hours. I appreciate the thoroughness of it and depth of it, and I think for me, it enlightens the possibilities of what is out there and what can happen and so forth. So it kind of gave us a good looking underneath the hood of what a first responder network could do in an opt-out situation. So I applaud everyone's time, the staff, everything for putting that together, because that's about a month. I think it took us, right? I think it's been a month.
Oh gosh. Well, it was
Longer.
a lot more. We started this process in March.
All I know is I lost some time. There was a lot of time. There was a lot of time. So again, thank you for everybody, and I'm sure we'll talk about more of it in the next meeting.
Right.
So
Any
Brian,
other
this is.
scores? Oh yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, so I don't know. I guess I have some comments that I think the board should know, but I don't know if it's more related under item 4 for the open discussion, or if I should discuss it now.
No, go ahead, since you were a scorer, so that you've earned that prerogative.
So I would say again, to echo the council members' comments, I think that going through the process definitely was able to help educate what the options and the opportunities are out there, as well as what some of the risks would be. And I do think the group did weigh those pretty heavily as we talked about the different merits of the different proposals. I will say for myself, part of the reason that I specifically voted in favor of the Rivada-Macquarie approach was that I have a number of reasons for it. Number one is that regardless of who we went through, as a matter of fact, we would actually have a contract with that company, and we're not going to have a contract with AT&T. AT&T is going to enter a contract to provide service to the end users, but they're not going to enter a contract to say we will build a certain number of sites, we will provide a certain level of service, we will guarantee a certain amount of uptime or performance. And we also don't have any kind of contract or relationship with FirstNet either. FirstNet gives us Tracy, who we can escalate through, but there's nothing to obligate FirstNet to do anything, so they can hear our complaints, but not necessarily do anything about it. So in an opt-out scenario, we actually have a contractual relationship with that entity. We can actually hold their feet to the fire and say that we want to be able to see specifics on their performance. We can establish a service level agreement. This is what each site has to be able to do, the throughput, transparency, et cetera. So going back to some of the earlier comments about the extra money that we would have to pay, whether we were to opt in or opt out, it is extra money to pay. But in this situation, we actually have a contract to hold those people's feet to the fire when we actually pay that money. Item number 2 for me is that any excess revenue that we receive from the network in the opt-out scenario can turn around and be reinvested in the network and the services that we want to provide in the state under the governing body's discretion. Whereas we already know that AT&T, or excuse me, FirstNet has said years ago that any excess revenue will be redirected towards the overall nationwide build. So I think the fact that we can reinvest and say that there are certain areas of the state that do not have the coverage that we want, or are over capacity, they don't have the capability to supply the service there, we'd be able to reinvest that money exactly as we think is appropriate within the state. Item number 3 is, again, being able to help focus on the local jobs and build out into a lot of different areas. They're going to be partnering with the regional partners quite a bit. And, it's not just we're going to resell an existing service. We're actually going to be doing building, construction, operations, maintenance, et cetera, which creates a lot more jobs in the local level. To me, another prevailing reason is that Band 14 under this plan would be deployed almost statewide. And we know that that's not the case with the FirstNet proposal or others that we've seen. And finally, just to reiterate kind of what you said, Brian, we're going to have another 240 days to decide. So we don't have to go down once we make this decision now, and this is the final decision. Now, I understand that there's the possibility that FirstNet and or AT&T may not provide some of the same incentives that they've provided to us if we choose to opt out and then opt in later. I understand that, but I guess my question would be, I would flip that on its side and say, again, we have no contract with AT&T. So we have no guarantee from AT&T today. I guess I would recommend to the governing body, you ask AT&T if these incentives that you plan to provide, if we were to opt in, we would like to see that either as a contract or some kind of binding agreement, not only that you will provide it, but timelines of when you will provide it and what it will provide for us. Because right now it's kind of a hope and a promise And I realize it's that way on the opt-out too, but again, at least we have a contract to hold those people's feet to the fire. And those are my main reasons for the recommendation I made.
This is Bob. I would only add that the SLA would also have to be in that agreement, not just the deployment, but the SLAs. That's been my biggest gripe. Because the SLAs right now are what with FirstNet between AT&T on the opt-in, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's on a nationwide level, not at a local level, right? Just want to confirm.
We don't know, Bob.
Okay, all right, but that would have to be something SLAs, and that I mean just everything that was just explained. I didn't know we were going to go down that path just yet, but I just need to echo that he's spot on all his comments because that the issue is going to be is the contractual obligations and relationships there, and the local control around those. So I echo the comments.
Any of the other RFP review committee that wish to speak their mind to the board?
Yeah, Brian, I'll go. This is Chad.
Yep.
I was one of the ones that that voted for the Verizon option to present to the rest of the board for consideration. It's not because I think I would find myself in the position to vote to actually opt out and go with Verizon's proposal. I think the risk is just too high. I mean, those dollars that Randy presented to us as the risks that we face by this not working out in the way that we hope and expect it will. I don't want to be on the hook for that. It doesn't mean that I'm pleased with the opt-in option. I don't think that opting in is going to result in a large number of increased subscriptions to the FirstNet network. But I do think the fourth option that Randy presented is interesting to basically do nothing and then look at what some of the other options are. I am a bit disappointed in what our options actually are, but I guess it's fair to say that I was one of the ones that voted for Verizon, and again, not necessarily because I think that's what we ought to do, but I think the board needed something to be able to consider, and if we had not approved one of the opt-out options, then we wouldn't even be needing to have this discussion. There wouldn't be anything else to discuss.
Good. Thanks, Chad. Anyone else? Don, Jim, Gary?
Yeah, this is Don. I'll chime in on a few things, and we'll talk more when we go into other session. But a couple of the one point that I want to make, in addition to things that have already been said, and I appreciate Randy's stuff, but I think the one main elephant in the room is if we opt out and become our own supplier of a network, now we're competing against Verizon and AT&T for subscriptions. If we opt in and nobody takes AT&T, it costs the state absolutely nothing. However, even in Rivada's proposal that said if there's not enough adoption by public safety, the Colorado RAND's financial stability may be compromised. And again, we're talking about revenues will be lower, and we're on the hook for those. There are too many landmines to look at this. I too am disappointed in the proposal, but I don't think as a state of Colorado we can commit to that financial liability. So I think it's good that everybody gets to hear all of it, but I think that's the reason why we have the phone call, to let the people know that due diligence was made, but that's why I went the way I did.
All right. Hey, Don, thanks for that. I think before we go too much more, because now we're starting to get into kind of the deliberative process, and there may be some answers to some of those questions that were just raised. I would rather not do that on this call, because the fact that right now we do have FirstNet AT&T on the call, but we do not have Rivada and McQuarrie on the call. And so I think to be fair to everybody involved, I don't really want us to discuss too much of the deliberative process right now on this call. That's what the next call will be for. So really, it's an opportunity for anybody, especially anybody that's not a governing body member, just to kind of express their opinion or provide any input that they would like the governing body to consider during our deliberative phone call, which will be coming up. So I'm actually going to ask kind of any of the governing body members to kind of withhold your stuff until the next call, if that's all right with everyone.
Sometime. Yes, so with that, we can kind of transition into general feedback. As we mentioned in the email that went out, we want an opportunity for everyone anyone who wishes to, provide feedback to the governing body. So are there any folks on the call, and maybe we can, just to avoid the talking over each other, maybe use the raise your hand functionality on, although some people aren't on there. So I guess perhaps maybe we can, we can just start with is there anyone that's interested in speaking to the governing body, and just maybe start by introducing yourself, and we'll try to manage the process. Yes, ma'am. Anyone on the call that wants to speak up? If anyone's trying, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Hey, Brian, I do have one other point, but I'll just wait to see if anybody else wants to speak up first.
Okay. Anyone besides Scott that wishes to discuss with the board? Okay, Scott, it's all you.
The only other point I'd like to make, because I do absolutely agree with my colleagues on the committee that the financial aspect is definitely the risk. The only other point I would like to point out is that the advantage that the Colorado plan presented is that it is a multi-use network. And again, no fault to FirstNet, but theirs is a specific purpose-built only to provide the wireless service. And the reason I point that out is that if we build this network, the network's going to be there regardless of how it's used. So to the extent that the alternative plan includes some of the other functions and features such as next-gen 911, telehealth, teleeducation, et cetera, that's additional ways to mitigate that risk and help finance the network.
Yep, good point, Scott. Thanks. Okay, so if there's no one else that wants to address the board, we'll move to our last item, which is the legal issues. Chad, to your point, so we have met with FirstNet lawyers to talk about the SMLA. Our attorney generals have met with FirstNet lawyer legal representation staff. We are currently working through them, some of the issues. The primary issue is that as it stands right now, the proposed lease violates our state constitution. So the attorney general, actually, I believe it was late last week, she got basically a red line version of the FirstNet lease back to FirstNet lawyers, essentially stating, just here's at a bare minimum, here are the changes we would need in order for this lease to fit within our state constitution. So they are working through that. I just saw some emails today. It looks like they are setting up a call for, I believe, either tomorrow or early next week to kind of talk through what those, like what is the source of those issues. For example, obviously Tabor is one. So I think the FirstNet lawyers want to understand, what the Tabor implications are of this and that type of thing. So we are working with them on that. Right now, it is just limited to kind of this very basic element of we couldn't even sign this lease right now if we thought it was the greatest thing ever. So once we can kind of get past that, then we would enter into discussions, as we talked about, Chad, to your point. Mr. Post, the CEO of FirstNet, stated in a public hearing to Congress that the lease was negotiable. And for example, the penalties he talked about, he said were worst case scenario, so that we would be able to discuss those. So I believe the other elements of the lease, once we got past this initial, the structure of it needs to fit within our state constitution. The next step of that, again, if we chose to go down the path of opting out, would be to start on the negotiation of the substance of the lease, so to speak. So that's where we're at with that process. Any questions?
I would hope.
Okay.
Scenario.
Oh, Say again, Chief or Chef.
Unnecessary. I would hope that was worst case scenario, for crying out loud.
All righty. So does anybody else have anything that they want to contribute to this meeting before we go ahead and adjourn this meeting and move into our governing body only meeting? All right, not hearing none, we're going to go ahead and close this meeting out. All governing body members, you should have a separate agenda that was sent to you with a different call-in. We'll reconvene the governing body only as soon as everybody can hang up and dial back in. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.